The Death of Superman Lives: What Happened is an absolutely fascinating documentary about one of the most interesting movies that was never made, Tim Burton's Superman Lives, starring Nicolas Cage. I actually was one of the Kickstarters for this documentary, so let's talk about it. Prior to the release of Superman Returns, Warner Brothers had spent nearly 20 years trying to get a fifth Superman movie made. The most interesting of these was Superman Lives. I actually remember back when I was in high school, Nicolas Cage going on a talk show and talking about, oh yeah, I've been cast as Superman, I'm a huge fan, I've actually named my son Kal-El, I love Superman, so excited, Tim Burton's gonna make it. And then it never happened. And for me, this was like the first time I remember realizing how Hollywood works. And sometimes they announce a movie, they start working on a movie, and it never comes out. And I didn't know what happened for the long time. That was until just a few years ago when Jon Schnepp, a guy that I'm a fan of, put out a Kickstarter saying he was going to make a documentary all about the making of this very weird Superman movie that we'd all seen pictures from, we'd heard rumors about, we'd all been like, what? Nicolas Cage is Superman? And he was going to do a serious documentary about the history of what happened to this movie. This is the first Kickstarter I ever supported. My name's actually in the credits of it, which is pretty cool. In this documentary, Jon Schnepp basically tries to track the history of where this movie came from, when it kind of peaked, and then how it all kind of collapsed, all by interviewing the creators of this movie that was, well, never created. While Schnepp interviews dozens of people throughout the movie, really the narrative comes from 3 interviews. One with Jon Peters, the producer of the movie that was there throughout the whole process. Another one from Kevin Smith, one of the writers at the early stages that was eventually booted. And then one from Tim Burton, who was the primary director of the project. And seriously, I could just watch any one of these interviews in full. They're all very interesting. Jon Peters and Kevin Smith are very interesting characters that are great storytellers, and then Tim Burton is a movie legend, and so hearing him talk about a project that clearly he was frustrated by, he's kind of embarrassed by, it's just a fascinating piece of history that he would talk so openly about. And what makes these interviews so interesting and then intercut with interviews with other people is that it's basically contrasting the producer Jon Peters' take on what happened with everyone else's. So Jon Peters is a fascinating character because he's essentially a stereotype of the crazy Hollywood producer. He apparently first was famous as a hair designer, then became a movie producer, and throughout this documentary, it's like filled with all of his crazy ideas, and he just addresses them just directly, straight on. People tell stories about him being in meetings with them, and he starts headlocking them and like challenges them to a fight. And then it cuts to him responding. He's like, oh yeah, I mean, you got to have an action hero vibe if you want to be successful in this industry. And this is contrasted with Kevin Smith, who has a very just kind of personal guy next door, just chatting with your buddy style to him for being kind of a pretty famous guy in Hollywood. And he clearly did not get along with Jon Peters. And Kevin Smith will tell these crazy stories about how Jon Peters wanted Superman not to have the regular costume and he couldn't fly, and he wanted a gigantic spider and he wanted polar bears and all these crazy ideas. And then it goes back over here to Jon Peters, who'll be like, oh yeah, totally. I mean, absolutely, polar bears are the scariest of the creatures. And it's fascinating just to watch these guys take this seriously. And Peters clearly knows he's at the butt end of the joke, that people blame him for this project never happening, for being a mess, all of it. He knows that and he owns it, but at the same time, he's defending himself and he thinks he was making this incredible movie. And maybe it would have been, as you're watching this going like, this is the craziest movie that never happened. And then once again, you get to Tim Burton talking about it, and he's just a legend, and it's just kind of heartbreaking to watch him talking about it because you can just see that it hurts that he spent so much time on this project that didn't come to be. And while Kevin Smith is the main writer they talk to the 2 other screenwriters that wrote totally different drafts of this project along the way, and them contrasting it. And some of them are like, I love Superman. Others are like, I don't really care about all this superhero stuff. Really interesting things. And there's a whole section of this that's showing the behind-the-scenes footage of Nicolas Cage and all of these costume tests. And if you know anything about this movie, you've seen these pictures of him in these costumes that look horrible, and he's wearing these terrible wigs, and he just looks ridiculous. And it shows the behind-the-scene footage where he's there talking about it with Tim Burton, and it's like 10 minutes of footage Now, this isn't a perfect documentary. I hate to call what I'm about to say criticisms. They're just observations. So the first observation is it lingers a good bit on kind of the production design. Once Tim Burton comes into the narrative of the documentary, it spends a lot of time showing you skull spaceships in costume design after costume design. And if you're into that, it gives you a ton of great stuff. That's not the stuff I'm normally really into, and so it kind of drags at a certain point just because that's not my thing. The second thing that really frustrated me a little bit is it never really gives you a clear beat by beat, let's walk you through what was this story going to be. And I have a feeling that's probably because each different version of the script was totally different. And like when Jon Peters is talking about Kevin Smith's draft, he says it was a total mess with no structure to it. I think they couldn't give much more than that because each one was so different, and it never did come together to have a plot that they could concisely tell. And the third thing that really disappoints is they don't get an actual new, fresh interview from Nicolas Cage. And I don't want to fault them at all for that because this is a Kickstarter funded thing, and I totally understand why that wouldn't happen. But man, you just think how much even better this would have been if you were contrasting 4 different narratives from 4 big, gigantic personalities in Hollywood, one of them being Nicolas Cage, who's kind of a crazy person. Man, that would have been awesome. As one of the backers of this project, I'm just happy that I got to be a part of this story getting to be told. Actually, I got to go to one of the premieres of it. It premiered here in Austin, where I live. Jon Schnepp was there and got to talk about the movie. And what's really interesting, like I said, sometimes the story behind a documentary is behind a movie is as interesting as the movie itself. This movie is very interesting because it took years and years to get made because Schnepp, working on a shoestring budget, was trying to schedule all these interviews and everything, and he didn't get Jon Peters until about a month before the movie was made. And basically, the interview with Jon Peters is kind of what drives the entire structure and narrative of this entire documentary. And that interview, he didn't get it until months right before the movie was finished. And it's just fascinating what this would have been if they hadn't had that interview, because that really ties this whole thing together and makes it so great to just see the differing opinions on this project. At the premiere, I actually got to interact with Schnepp a little bit. I didn't talk to him too much because he looked really tired. And so actually when I took a picture with him, I did one of these kind of selfies with him in the background type deal. So there it is in the background. If you're someone that's curious about how movies are made, you have to see this. This is an incredible documentary where you get big Hollywood personalities being honest about a movie that fell apart, that they're probably a little bit embarrassed by. And so it's just such an honest look behind the curtain of how all of this comes together. I highly encourage you to go see it. So have you seen The Death of Superman Lives? What happened? If you have, comment below and tell me what you think about it. And if you like this video, check out another one of my videos called 11 Forgotten Marvel Movies. It's all about other movies kind of like this that kind of get forgotten in history. If you're curious about movies, think about clicking that subscribe button. I'd love to talk with you in the comment section. I don't want to just talk about movies. I want to talk with you about those movies. I try to respond to every comment and get in a discussion because that's really why I started making these movies, so I could talk to you about movies. Thank you for watching.